Hi. I had said in the introductory video that we would be discussing some controversial and sensitive topics in this class. And we're really going to kick that off right here in Chapter 2 by looking at evolution. And because evolution is at the core of everything that we're going to do for the rest of the class, I'm going to do things a little bit differently in terms of the video lectures. And I'm going to do 3 video lectures for Chapter 2. In this first video lecture, I wanted to discuss the controversy a little bit. In the second video, I'll talk about some misconceptions about evolution. And then finally, in the third video, I'll give a couple of oversimplified examples of how evolution works to hopefully illustrate it to you a little bit. As I said, evolution is a controversial topic, at least in the United States. And it's kind of interesting because if you go to most other industrialized societies around the world, the teaching of evolution is not particularly controversial. Even in heavily religious societies, it's not particularly controversial. But we've made it controversial here in the United States, and the result is that we do a really poor job of teaching our students in our public schools about evolution. And that's really unfortunate because we do live in the 21st century, and right now, as part of our social existence, of part of our species success, things like bioengineering and genetic technology have become more and more important. And yet, we in the United States, a country that proclaims itself to be the greatest nation in the world, don't really teach students the core principles about biology, theory of evolution, to prepare them for those fields and for those disciplines. And beyond that, there are other consequences. I mean, I guarantee you that at some point you will have questions that you have to answer, whether it's because of an issue that's being voted for example, or maybe a situation where you have to answer questions because you're the caregiver for somebody that somebody important to you, and you're making medical decisions for that person. And the greater understanding that you can have of basic biological principles, the more informed decisions that you will be able to make, either on that ballot, or for that political question, or for that loved one that you care about, or for any number of other things. So having a basic understanding of evolution is important. And I do suspect that there are many of you in the class who are skeptical about evolution. And I hope that I can kind of clear up some of the misconceptions so that at least you can understand why it is such an important principle to the biological sciences. But first, it's important to note 2 things. First, evolution works. That's one thing that I have to be absolutely clear about. People who are hostile to evolution try to poke holes in it and try to, as if they can prove that evolution has one thing wrong, that will unravel the entire theory of evolution. But then they don't think about the consequences of that, because a lot of what we do in our day-to-day lives is built upon evolutionary theory. I mean, think about it. Our entire medical system is based on an understanding of evolution, whether we realize it or not. Our agricultural system, when farmers are planting their crops or they're raising livestock, they're applying evolution. Our criminal justice system, if you like shows like CSI or Bones or any of these forensic science shows, forensic science is all about evolution. I did forensic anthropology for nearly 10 years. The only way I could tell about somebody from their skeleton was because I understood how the evolutionary process has impacted the human skeleton. If evolution doesn't work, then any person who has ever been convicted of a crime in the United States based on forensic evidence needs to be set free, because forensic science doesn't work without evolution. So evolution is incredibly important, and it does work. The other thing is that we have to consider that the controversy of evolution is kind of a historical question. So we're going to go back in history a little bit, real briefly. And for simplicity's sake, we'll only go back about 100 years to 1924, 1925 in Tennessee. And there was a man there named John Scopes. And John Scopes was a substitute biology teacher at a high school in Tennessee. And at the time, Tennessee had a law that made it illegal to teach evolution in the public school classrooms. And John Scopes was accused under that law of having taught evolution. So he went to trial and he was found guilty. He was fined $100, which in today's money is about $1,500. The Tennessee Supreme Court later overturned his conviction and threw out the penalty that he faced, the fine that he faced. But nonetheless, this trial, what became known as the Scopes monkey trial, really begins the start of this era in the United States where there's a conflict about teaching evolution. Because what happened is after the trial, when he was found guilty, a lot of other states followed Tennessee's lead, and they introduced anti-evolution laws that would have prohibited the teaching of evolution. Now, most of those laws failed. There were about 41 of them that were proposed, and only Mississippi and Arkansas, in addition to Tennessee, actually passed those laws. So you had 3 states that had laws that banned the teaching of evolution. But nonetheless, even though most of the other laws had failed, one consequence was that school districts, and even more importantly, textbook manufacturers, feared that if they taught evolution as a school district, or if they had evolution in their textbook as a textbook publisher, they would find themselves the subject of legal challenges and get dragged into court, and those things would be expensive and there'd be a lot of bad publicity. So even though these laws didn't pass, a lot of textbook manufacturers, there were only a few textbook manufacturers, but textbook manufacturers began to remove evolution from their textbooks, so that by the late 1930s it had virtually disappeared. And it wasn't until 1968, in a separate court case called Epperson versus Arkansas, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that laws banning the teaching of evolution were unconstitutional, and the tide began to shift back a little bit, but nonetheless, the controversy remained. And this illustrates a couple of things. One of them is it illustrates how powerful these types of events can be in having far more reaching impact. I mean, the Scopes monkey trial was, for all intents and purposes, a pretty limited event in a small town in Tennessee, but it became national news and had repercussions that rippled for decades. This example of the textbooks is still something that happens today. I've included a link here at the underneath this video to a story from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart from a couple of years ago. And although the type of textbook is different, it illustrates the same principle. This is a story of the state of Texas, who was redoing their high school history curriculum and the consequences that that had for textbooks. And it had consequences nationwide because, as I said, there are very few textbook publishers, and Texas is one of the states that buys the most textbooks. So what Texas says they want in a textbook, they pretty much get. And a publisher isn't going to put different stuff in a textbook because Connecticut wants something different or Vermont wants something different. So the larger states really do have this disproportionate impact on the way things are taught around the country. And if they don't like something, it gets removed. And it gets removed for the textbooks that end up getting used in states all around the country. So I hope you'll take a few minutes to look at the Jon Stewart video. He obviously, if you're familiar with The Daily Show, he will cover the topic in a far more entertaining way than I'm sure I can. And to consider this idea that this really marks this era of a debate in the United States over how we should teach evolution, or if we should teach evolution. Another consequence or ripple effect of the Scopes monkey trial, and then particularly, or in additionally, the 1968 Supreme Court decision, is that the two sides in the debate, you had the creationists who opposed the teaching of evolution, and you had scientists that argued in favor of teaching evolution. The creationists lost that fight. The 1968 law or the 1968 Supreme Court decision that said laws banning evolution were unconstitutional. And then a couple years later, I believe it was 1972, I'd have to double check, the Supreme Court reached another decision that said teaching creationism as science is also unconstitutional because creationism is not science. Creationism is religion. So another impact that we see is that the courts, because of court decisions, the two sides have changed a little bit. You still have scientists in favor of the teaching of evolution, but what happened in the creationist camp is that the creationists said, all right, if we can't teach creationism, we need to come up with something that we can call science so that we can teach it. So they came up with this thing called intelligent design. And really, intelligent design is creationism just under a different name. And there have been a couple of recent court cases that have recognized that. But what creationists argue is that intelligent design is their own scientific theory, and that it needs to be taught alongside evolution. That, okay, fine, you're going to teach evolution, but at least teach the counterpoint to it so that students can make up their own minds. There are a whole host of problems with that position. I'll address many of those in the second video, but understand that that's kind of where we stand today, that more and more evolution is accepted and is being taught in our schools, but it's still not being taught very well. And there's this really strong push to include the teaching of intelligent design alongside evolution as if it is a equal counter argument or an equally scientific idea as the theory of evolution is, which, as I said, in the next video, hopefully I'll explain to you why that is not the case. So, as I say, take a few minutes and look at that Jon Stewart video just to see this impact of textbook decisions, and hopefully you will enjoy the next video as well. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the discussion forum or shoot me a message, and I will do my best to answer your question.